Oh, so good to be with you this morning, everybody. Yeah, this is just fun to be together. And the air in here feels really nice, right? And yeah, I can see you all. Something changed with the lights. It's different. So I can see everybody way better. I love it. Anyway, we got a real important topic to talk about this morning. Let me tell you a story. A few years ago, Darlene and I led a pilgrimage trip to the Holy Lands, to Israel. And to Jordan. And we had 33 people from a church. It's a church that we've worked with for years and people we know and love dearly. So we were so excited to be in the Holy Land with 33 of our friends. And we were going through different places and we finally came to Jerusalem. Now, just a show of hands, have any of you been to Israel? Just I'm a little bit curious. Okay, a couple people have in the audience. Good. Yeah, 5, 6 of you have been to Israel. But Jerusalem is made up of 4 quadrants. There's the Jewish section, there's the Christian section, there's the Armenian section, and there's the Muslim section. And our tour guide decided to drop us off. I don't know why. Maybe it was the bus fit better on that side of Jerusalem because it's surrounded by walls, and then there are gates where you enter. And our tour bus dropped us off at the Lion's Gate, which then sent all 33 of us right into Jerusalem, into what the largest quarter is called the Muslim quarter. Well, to me, it's all Jerusalem, and it's all very fun to walk through. So as we walked through and we were walking down, we were going to have lunch in that place as kind of our first event. As we walked through the Muslim quarter, I kind of noticed that everyone in our group seemed a little bit anxious, like a little bit nervous. And they weren't smiling like they are in this picture. Not that you can quite see that, right? But this is looking over Jerusalem. I know it's not a great screen in the background there, but that's us standing overlooking Jerusalem. But then when we walk, the next slide shows you as we're walking into the Muslim quarter, kind of what it looks like. There's streets and lots of lights and lots of wares being sold and all kinds of things. But I just noticed that people seemed nervous. They seemed really anxious, and they started walking faster, and they didn't really want to look at the people around them. And I didn't know what to do with that, except to kind of observe at that point and be like, hey guys, isn't it great to be in Jerusalem? And we're here. Well, we finally made it kind of out of the Muslim quarter. We're standing kind of in the center where all those quarters connect. And it was time to go figure out where we were going to eat lunch. And I heard a number of people say, I'm going to the Christian quarter. I'm going to the Christian quarter. I'm going to the Christian quarter to eat lunch. And Darlene and I looked at each other and gave us kind of one of those winks when you know you just have to do something different. And so everybody kind of went off on their separate ways to lunch and broke apart. And where do you think Darlene and I went to lunch? Well, you figured it out, right? So we come back after lunch, and everybody's sharing where they went to lunch. And they said to Darlene and I, where did you go eat lunch? We said the Muslim quarter. And we literally got, oh, were you okay? Did anybody try to hurt you? Was it weird? Was it strange? And we're like, no, the food was great. And the people, the restaurant we ate at, owned by a Muslim family, were so warm and so welcoming, I'd go back. And they just kind of looked at us with blank stares. And I realized something in that moment, that when people have fear of something they don't understand, it causes them to make decisions that might not be the best decisions and to actually act in kind of hurtful ways. And that was like a big wake-up call for us. And we were there for a good number of days, so we'd have a chance to unpack some of that, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in just a minute. But that's why in this series, God Outside the Box, we are going to deal with all kinds of issues about thinking about how God might think. Okay? Not how we think, but how God might think. Because we all have tendencies to want to squish God into a little tiny box that fits with our size beliefs, not God's size beliefs, right? Our perspectives on the world, not God's perspective on creation and the world that God created. You tracking with me? And one of the biggest ways we do that is by making assumptions about what God thinks about people of other races, of other nationalities, of other ethnic origins, and so on. The view that God is like us, but God's not so sure about strangers. What does God think about those strangers? So this morning, we're in this subject, and we're going to talk about how do we get beyond what's called, big word, xenophobia, okay? Now, that's a word that I hadn't even heard until a number of years ago when it started being used in the media. And I didn't know what the heck it meant. I'd never heard that word used very much. And I didn't know what to do. So let me explain it a little bit. What is xenophobia, right? Aren't many words that start with an X, right? It comes from the ancient Greek word, two words actually put together, xenos, which means strange, or foreign, or alien, and phobos, which means fear. Fear of the stranger, fear of the alien, fear of the other, okay? It's the fear or dislike of anything which is perceived as being foreign or strange. It's an expression which is based on the perception that a conflict even exists, that there's an in-group and an out-group, and it may manifest itself in suspicion of one group's activities by members of the other group. A desire to eliminate the presence of that group, which is the target of suspicion, and fear of losing a national, ethnic, or racial identity. Do you feel that around us today in the culture in which we live? It's like all around. And it's been growing over a number of years in a way that makes, I don't know, it makes my heart sad. I don't know always what to do with it. It's literally us versus them, right? Us, whatever our perspective is, we're the ones God likes. We're the loved ones. We're the right ones. We're the special ones. And then there's them, everyone who's not us, right? Us versus them is this perspective that is so damaging. And we see it today all over us, and it's a huge problem, okay? Now, I know in a sense, as I was preparing this week, I thought, you know what? I'm speaking to the choir. New City Church is this amazingly diverse church where we're all trying to figure out how to exist around a bunch of people that aren't us, that don't look like us. They might not talk like us. They might not have the same backgrounds. They're not the same socioeconomic class. They have different levels of education. They have, get what I'm saying? And so I know I'm preaching to the choir, but I know you all need to take it to everybody else. So I know you have all this figured out already. But just so I think we need to get on the same page, right, about what God thinks about these things. What are some examples today? Because I think xenophobia is more broad than any of us might imagine. Okay? Things like, we know, I'll start with probably the biggest one, racial prejudice and hatred. That's huge, right? During COVID pandemic, right in that same time frame, we went through BLM, Black Lives Matter, right? This church did some amazing things to help educate everybody about that specific issue. Another huge growing thing in our day is anti-Asian racism. It is huge. I, being a professor at Fuller Seminary as well, have had to go through some trainings and stuff to make me aware of those things because there's a lot of Asian American students at Fuller Seminary, and I need to be aware of that. What about anti-Semitism? That's a big one we're hearing right now, right? Happening on college campuses and such. What about Palestinian prejudice? Okay? On and on. We could go on and on, but these are examples of that racial prejudice. A second one, and we did talk about this a little bit a few weeks ago, but harsh, judgmental attitude toward our LGBTQ siblings. That's huge. Often today, when I share, because we have a lot of friends, when Darlene and I share that we've become inclusive and affirming of our LGBTQ friends, people don't quite understand. And when they don't understand, and then I can tell they don't understand, and they're trying to figure out how we've changed our mind or changed our thinking, because they know what we used to believe and they know what we think and now have changed our lives to back that up. They don't know what to do. First question I ask them, do you know any LGBTQ people? Do you got any friends? Do you hang out with any? And usually I get, well, yeah, there's one at my work. One at my work. Well, what's their name? Yeah, I think it's, I don't know. And I just try to gently point out that maybe that's why it's hard to understand, because I know that was true of Darlene and I shared that story a few sermons ago, but I've learned the extent of their fears directly related to how many LGBTQ humans they know. Just go find some. Try to befriend others that you might not be like. Here's a third one. Unbalanced perspectives on wars and global conflicts. We could spend a whole sermon just talking about that. But what have we seen for many months now, right? This Israeli-Palestinian conflict. What's gone on in Gaza? and now moving into the West Bank, and all that tension that's lived there for years, for decades, and in some senses, centuries. A fourth one, fear-based avoidance of the unhoused or other marginalized groups. And people have so much fear around that. On Tuesdays, when we have our staff meeting here at the church office, is just right across the street. I take the train into Union Station, and I love walking from the train station all the way to the church office. 1.3 miles, I know, because I've done it many times, dozens of times now. It's so fun for me to do that. When I tell people that know me, people are like, same response almost has happened in Jerusalem. Are you okay? Is it safe? Has anybody attacked you? Have you been mugged? You know what? Less people talk to me on the street here than they do where I live in Orange County. I feel more safe here sometimes than I do in my own backyard. And so the answer I give is no, it's a beautiful walk. I absolutely love being there, but I can tell once again that when you don't know, I walk by dozens and dozens of tents and wonderful humans who are sleeping on the street. And if I could help them in some way, I'd love to help every single one of them on my walk back and forth, back and forth. Yesterday, I had the privilege of giving a homeless man living on a cardboard box on the street a couple of bottles of water. I said, thank you, sir. God bless you. Just thank you so much, because it's hot out there, right? How do we just not be so fearful of things we don't understand? Another one, fifth one, the immigration issue. The intensification of the migration phenomenon that's happening has led to growing interest in the public domain about the attitude toward foreigners and all immigrants. Our family supported a young girl in Quito, Ecuador, for many years through Compassion International. We supported a number of children, especially as our kids were growing up, and just loved to get to know them. But the one we got to know the best was a girl named Allison. And Allison lived and grew up in the it's kind of the dump area outside of Quito, Ecuador, a little area called Carmen Bajo. And we had visited that with our family and our kids and got a chance to be in her home, which was kind of made of cardboard and some metal and some wood and some plywood and with a dirt floor. And when we walked into that home, one of the things we saw was a picture of our family in that home. So we got to know little Allison as she grew up from elementary school age to teenage years to now someone in her 20s, and she aged out of Compassion International. So recently, we found out that her brother needed to leave because he was a teenager, 17 years old, I believe, and wanted to get out of the pressure of being in the gangs that exist around Quito. So he started walking from Quito, Ecuador, all the way to the United States. Good news, he made it. He made it. But then we heard Allison, who's a couple years older, early 20s. Allison connected with us because we would talk through Messenger and such, and we've stayed connected. Sometimes it's recommended not to stay connected with your kids, but we want to love these kids in any way we can. We supported them for years and years and years and years. How can we love them now? Allison tells us, I'm walking. What we didn't know, Allison had gotten pregnant and had had a baby, and now had a month or 2 month old baby. And she started walking from Quito, Ecuador, the thousands of miles through the Darien Gap, Central America, through Mexico, all the way to the border. Good news, she made it. She made it. And thanks to our daughter, who's bilingual, more than Darlene and I are, who coached her literally the entire way by text and tried to figure out and being able to help her resource-wise as well to make that trip. That opened our eyes to immigration when we knew someone who made 1,000-ish miles, I don't even know how many miles it is. Do you know how many miles it is? Walk from that place all the way here. And her brother are now living in Indiana with the goal of getting jobs. They're working. They desire to help their family and send money back home. Dad is a paraplegic. And it really had a tough time working, is in a wheelchair, and him and mom separated. So their kids want to help, their dad especially, mom, and to be able to send people back. But that broke our hearts. Immigration looks really different when you know someone that's trying to get into this country, like my grandma did decades ago, right? And how many of us, some of our relatives came to this country decades ago. I preached a sermon on this issue of immigration. The whole sermon wasn't even on that. It was kind of more like, how do we love people that we don't know? Kind of this kind of sermon. And it was at a church I've preached at many, many times. And I used an example. It wasn't this example because it hadn't happened yet, but it was an example of a young girl whose family had immigrated to the States. And when she went to go to college, she was 16 years old. She got like a full ride scholarship to the college. And then she figured out all behind the scenes without telling her parents that she had this scholarship and she could go to school. But when she told them, they said, "You can't go." And she said, "Why not?" And she didn't know at 16 years old, but she didn't know because she was illegal. She couldn't receive all this scholarship gift and everything. And her whole world blew up. So anyway, it was a long story, a beautiful story. Darlene and I heard her tell that story in person. And it just wrecked me. So I shared that story as an example. And afterwards, I had someone come up to me and tell me, "You're going to hear from us. We're telling the church about, that you've shared this because those people are illegal." And then she just went on and on and on. And she told the elders, and thankfully elders knew me, and we had an educational experience together. But it was hard, right? A misunderstanding of why people come and how do we help and, what's legal and illegal versus what's ethical. What is kingdom? What does God want us to do with these things? Here's another one. Fear or hatred of other religions. This began huge in the United States, in my lifetime at least, with September 11th, right? 9/11, and the Islamophobia that raised up out of that because of the way the planes hit the buildings and who were flying the planes, and now we're scared to death of anyone who looks like the people that were flying the planes. What about LDS, Mormon missionaries that come door to door, right? I've got about 100 Mormon relatives, or ex-Mormon relatives, but a whole bunch of people, and I know them and love them. So when Mormon missionaries come to our door, what we do now is we open the door and say, "Hey, come on in, hang out. Let's hang out with us." And we actually had for dinner one night, the two Mormon missionaries. It was two guys, that this usually is. Sometimes they have ladies now, which is fun, but they came in and sat down for dinner with us, and we asked them a bunch of questions, but one of the questions I remember asking was, who has been the hardest for you on your mission? Like when you go door to door, and who's the meanest to you? You know what they said? Christians. We live near a big church, and many of our neighbors go to this very large church, but they're the meanest. And I asked for some examples, and they shared some examples of that meanness. And with kind of tears in my eyes, I just said, "Can I ask your forgiveness for that meanness they've shown you?" They're working so hard, right? And whatever you think about the LDS church is a different issue than the way we treat other humans who are committing their lives to something. We don't have to be mean. It just breaks me up. Darlene showed me an example she found just this morning, so I kind of scribbled it into my notes, but people with disabilities, and maybe this used to be more strong before, and I'm not exactly sure, so I apologize if I don't mean to be insensitive, but those with disabilities had their rights taken away or were siloed in hospitals because they made people feel uncomfortable. My gosh, right? We could go on and on and on and on and on. So go back to Jerusalem now, and this group of people, this Torah group, right? And what's going on with this Torah group? So now we're on the Sea of Galilee a number of days later, and the Sea of Galilee is it's really a lake. It's a big, giant lake, right? So we're on a boat, and here's a picture of me kind of teaching the group. There's 30 of us, so you can't see everybody, but that's the Sea of Galilee, kind of mountains in the background and something like that. And I realized that after what happened in Jerusalem, I really needed to say some things and share some things about what people were feeling like going to the other side of the lake. And I knew there was a story in there, and we're going to look at this passage in just a minute. We're going to read through this passage pretty quickly, okay? But in the midst of that, I wanted to share some of the similar thoughts I'm sharing with you. Basically, how not to be afraid of others who are different from you. And they just kind of looked at me kind of with a glazed look, like, "Oh yeah, okay. And then just like a day or two later, there was a person in our group who said loudly in our bus to someone else she was shouting at, "Be careful, there's a bunch of Muslims over there." And within earshot of our bus driver, who was a Palestinian Muslim. And so we kind of had to ask her and say, do you realize our bus driver? And we've gotten to know him. And do you realize what you said? And she went, oh, I had no idea. And so we asked her if she could apologize, and she did. But you get that kind of that when we don't know, we're insensitive. And that was a rough trip, you guys. That was a rough tour in some ways. We would meet in the evenings to try to have sessions together, and it was rough in ways. That was the rough part. It was beautiful, and I loved the people, and we learned so much, but the rough part had to do with what we're talking about here today. So let's look what the Bible says about this. And again, we're going to go pretty quick. So Mark chapter 4. Verses 35 to 41 starts off, and it says, on that day, when evening had come, he said to them, Jesus is talking, let us go across to where? The other side. That's really significant. The other side. Okay? Jesus was leaving a predominantly Jewish section in Galilee, right, where Jesus and the disciples kind of lived and hung out, to go to the eastern, mostly Gentile coast. This was the region of the Gerasenes. Now, does that sound familiar? Because in Mark chapter 5, we run into the Gerasene demoniac. Okay? The story in Scripture that talks about Legion, this man who had a legion of demons. And then the demons get cast out, and they're cast into a herd of pigs, and the pigs run over the side of a cliff, and it's this very intense story, right? And so things like that happened in that region. We've been there. It was another section that we walked, and it's still very desolate today. At least the area alongside the lake of the Gerasenes is really desolate. But who knows what the disciples might have heard about what was going on in that area, in that city, or on the lake. Rumors and gossip about this strange place. And here's the first thing I want to get. And there's no slide on this, so if you're taking notes, just jot this down. But the first thought from this verse, we're often fearful of things we don't know or understand. Right? It's pretty simple. We're fearful of things we don't know or things we don't understand. Well, what's the easiest solution to solve this problem? Learn about those you don't understand. That's where it has to start. Learn about that. Make some new friends who are different than you. I think that's so important. Have you ever had an experience where meeting or talking to someone different than you changed your whole perspective about that person, or that race, or that culture, or that fill in the blank? Anything, right? On another trip, same place, Israel, but a previous trip there, Darlene and I were going from Jerusalem back to Tel Aviv, where the airport is, and we had a taxi driver. And most of the taxi drivers in the area are, do you want to guess? Palestinian Muslims. Okay? So we're in the taxi, and I was thankful to be going to the airport, but we sat in the back seat, having that little conversation, you know, the kind of chit-chat that you do. I just wanted to learn about this person. So I asked about him, and he shared about his wife, and he shared about his family, and he shared about his story, and he shared about his work and how every day he would go from kind of the occupied territories into Jerusalem, and he had the permit to do that, and then he did this job, and then he'd go back home. But at the very end, I'll never forget, just as we were about to leave the taxi, he, through the rearview mirror, as he looked back at us sitting in the back seat, he said, I just want my family to be well. We just want to be happy. We just want to be safe. And that was after many stories of telling us instances. And what I realized at that point, there's a human sitting in this taxi that is no different than me. And yet their life is oppressed. Their life is challenged. Their life is so, so difficult in so many ways. And that just wrecked me. It really just wrecked me. Let's go on to the next section, verse 36. And leaving the crowd behind, they took him with them in the boat. Just as he was, other boats were with him. A great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat so that the boat was already being swamped. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him up and said to him, Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? Now, this is fascinating because just as he was, what does that mean? Just as he was. What, maybe wearing a life jacket or something? Like, Jesus have a life jacket and they didn't? I don't know. Or maybe, just maybe, and those of you psychologists in the room would appreciate this, Jesus was, I think, always a non-anxious presence, right? He wasn't anxious. He was very calm. In fact, Dallas Willard's one word to describe Jesus when asked, what one word would you use to describe Jesus? You know the word he used? Relaxed. I love that. Jesus was relaxed. He was non-anxious, right? And you could miss it if you blink, but in the passage it says other boats were with him. They weren't alone. They had some spare lifeboats, like around them, okay? It wasn't the only boat that was out there. The issue is not safety. And so Jesus gets in, finds a cushion, and takes a nap. Love that, right? He finds a cushion, goes to the back of the boat, takes a nap. Mark emphasizes, the whole Gospel of Mark, the book of Mark, emphasizes the humanness of Jesus, okay? Not the divinity, not the God-likeness of Jesus, but the humanity of Jesus. And I think that's significant. Even for those who might have only seen Jesus' humanity at that point, it still seems better than taking just another fisherman, right? Because they'd seen the things Jesus said, seen the things that Jesus did, and the kind of the power he had accessible to him. So here's a second thought. Fear increases our normal anxiety. Jesus is a non-anxious presence, but fear increases our anxiety and makes us more anxious. Makes us more anxious. And that's important to understand. They were fishermen, used to being on boats. They were with Jesus and had seen Jesus' miracles. But it's important to understand that certain fears are just kind of built into our brain, our nervous system, and our emotions for protective reasons to keep us from harm and allow us to survive. So if that's where you experience fear, don't beat yourself up about that, right? That's your brain saying protect yourself, okay? Sometimes it's okay. We need to be fearful. We need to be protective. We understand that. But other fears don't have as much to do with survival or harm, but might have been increased in us growing up or somewhere in our experience. My example, I lived with a mom that worked for an insurance company. All day long, she spent time paying out claims where people got hurt. So what kind of mother do you think I had? An overprotective mother, because she thought that every single thing could potentially kill me, or at least hurt me and do damage. So, Michael, don't do this. Michael, be careful going there. Remember to watch this. Make sure you call at this time. Make sure you come home here. My mom loved me dearly, but I grew up with fear. Why? Because it gets built into us right early on. Mom, sorry, you're laughing with me, I know. But I learned early on that everything my mother taught me to be fearful of was not really a danger. It just wasn't. I think I might have shared this story here, but when I was in college going to a Bible study that was in the San Fernando Valley, one of our friends was Gerald. Gerald, African-American, great guy. Everybody in our Bible study loved him. And this was a little bit different. The demographics were different back here in the 80s when I was going to college. So I believe Gerald was the only African-American in our white, like all-white Bible study. Okay, but I had to take Gerald home one night. And Gerald took the bus to Bible study. And then when I had to take him home, I said, well, where do you live? He said, I live at Union Rescue Mission. I'm like, oh, wow, okay, let's go. How do we get there? This was before the day of Waze and like Google Maps and stuff. So it was like pull out the Thomas Guide map and figure out how to get to downtown LA. So I drove to downtown LA and found Union Rescue Mission and dropped Gerald off. He says, thanks so much, Mike. I'll see you next week. And I took him a number of times. I dropped him off. But the first time I came back and mom was one of those moms who always waited up till I got home. Hey, Michael, you're later than normal from Bible study. Yeah, I had to drop a friend off. Oh, where'd your friend live? Union Rescue Mission? You went to downtown LA at like 12 midnight to drop someone off? And I lived to tell about it, Mom. It's okay. It's okay down there. That was my first experience, by the way, with Union Rescue Mission, way back in the early 80s when I dropped off Gerald. Or I grew up in an apartment in Van Nuys where more Mexican people lived than white people. I was the minority in that apartment. And so I love frijoles now. And Mexican music like brings back memories to me, right? But I was in a place where it was a little bit different. And I had to figure out how to navigate some of that and not do it in a bigoted, judgmental, prejudicial way. And I've since learned with other areas, like sexual orientation, religion, those of other races, that any anxiety I had was because I did not know them or talk to them or befriend them or do life with them. It's just different. Verse 39, and waking up, Talking about Jesus again. Jesus rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Be silent, be still." Then the wind ceased and there was a dead calm. He said to them, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" Interesting passage. Could it be that what they were afraid of is not what we normally talk about from the passage? Now, I'm going to be honest with you, okay? I'm reading between the lines here. Do you ever do that when you read the Bible? Just kind of wonder, maybe we missed something. There might be more going on here that meets the eye. I think they might have been anxious after getting in the boat and Jesus wanting to go where? To the other side. Could it be that their anxiety was less about the waves? These guys were fishermen. The Sea of Galilee always had tons of waves, and waves could come, this squall, this wind would come up and make waves. They were fishermen, they lived their life in boats. Somehow it doesn't quite rest with me that that's the main issue, even though the passage talks about that, right, in their fear, and they wanted Jesus to fix the storm and everything. But could it be that underneath the surface, they were just fearful of going where? To the other side. And they were using the wind and waves as an excuse. Oh, the sea's stormy. Jesus, get us out. We got to turn this boat around and go back to Galilee where it's safe. Where it's safe. Our side. The us side, not the them side. That make sense? I'm just wondering. Just work with me, right? I don't know if that's really happened, but I think it's fun to think about. And maybe they were exaggerating their fear about the storm in hopes that Jesus would feel sorry for them and not take them to that scary other side. So this third thought, fear keeps us from faith. Fear keeps us from faith. Jesus had no problem telling the truth. Jesus was also full of grace. Jesus was full of grace and truth. Really important to know. And his only question, notice it, have you still no faith? Kind of blunt. Jesus was good at being blunt. Have you still no faith? What are you afraid of right now? And honestly, all these are valid fears for us, everybody. Money issues, health issues, housing issues, being hurt or abused by someone. Those are all valid fears. Jesus wants us to know that fears are real, but the power of faith is also real. Right? It's not either or, it's both and. Faith is real. Faith doesn't mean being stupid. It doesn't mean spending money unwisely or not going to a doctor with a health issue or making yourself vulnerable to an abuser or a victimizer. That's stupid. Okay? Don't do that. That's really important to understand. Faith just might mean you have to learn something you don't know now. Can we learn? Faith might mean making a friend who looks different than you. Verse 41, last one. And they were filled with great fear and said to one another, "Who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him?" Fear keeps us from seeing reality. They couldn't see it. The contrast here seems to be cowardice versus faith, but then it also could have to do with avoidance of the very thing that Jesus knew they would need in order to be good disciples and one day apostles. Can't be good disciple. Can't be good apostle. Can't bring the gospel to Asia Minor, Turkey, Greece, all the ways the gospel spread out, Africa, all those places. You can't do that if you're fearful of those people. Why? They look different than you do. They talk different. They have different languages than you do. You can't even do the call of the kingdom of God if you're fearful. This was their education. To them, they were on a lake. They'd been on hundreds of times with Jesus, who was the single best person to be with in a scary situation. For us, we let fear keep us from love, acceptance, equality, and justice. So how do we go away today? What can we go away with? Hopefully you're thinking about some things, and hopefully some of this has been helpful. Maybe it's more for me. I don't know. I'm preaching to myself. But two thoughts, just as we close. How do we move away from dehumanization? Dehumanization, right? Making someone who feels like the other, less human than us. Yesterday, I was looking at Old School here, a USA Today newspaper. Remember these things, newspapers? And came across a great article. Darlene read it first, and then I did. And I just circled a couple quotes because it's by an author here, Mishka Ispe. Not sure if that's how you say her name, but she wrote a wonderful article. The context of this was Pride, June being Pride Month. But she said a couple of things about this. She said, dehumanization starts with fixating on one facet of someone's identity to the exclusion of everything else. It starts with putting conditions on someone's inherent worth. It starts with saying loving someone doesn't have to mean affirming them. When you refuse to see someone's full humanity, you give yourself permission to commit atrocities. And it's happening right now across America. This Pride Month, she says, I'm reclaiming the notion of pride from what evangelicalism taught me it meant. Our beauty, worth, and goodness are inherent to our humanity. And catch her last line. The real sin lies in any attempt to dictate the conditions of our worth. Right? Dehumanization. If someone says, you're not worth it, that's the sin, right? That's the problem there. So let's move away from dehumanization and let's move to this, and this is the last thought. From xenophobia to xenophilia. You know what that is? Philia, phileo, means love, right? Xeno, if that's the other, the stranger, the person that seems different than you. How do you move from xenophobia, fear of people that are different than you, the other, to xenophilia and love those people? And let me just close with this poem. It's called Xenophobia. It's by Amy Ludwig van der Water, and she says this: if you had xenophilia and I had xenophobia, and we were from two cultures far apart as night and day, then I would want to run from you, and you would want to run to me. And I would cry to look at you, and you would want to play. I love that. Everything would frighten me. Your different skin, your different prayer. You would find me beautiful. You'd reach your hand, you'd try to share, and I would hide inside my fears, and I would tremble in my tears. Such loneliness might last for years, but you would still be there. And one day I would look at you, your different prayer, your different skin. I'd see your hand extended, and I'd know that we were kin. I'd know you waited for me with a love I did not earn. It might take me a while, but eventually I'd learn. God, help us to learn. God, help us to let go of our fears, the fears that we need to let go of, the fears that keep us from other people, that cause dehumanization. God, help us, help us, help us in this. God, give us chances in our lives to come across people. We here, downtown LA, not hard to do, coming across people that are different than us. Some of us, though, maybe not so much. Maybe it's not as easy. I know it wasn't for me growing up always as easy. So help us to look with eyes of love, the way Jesus did. God, a xenophilia, other love. And when we see difference, help us not to run out of anxiety. Help us to be curious. Help us to be kind. Help us to take a little risk and reach out a hand of love, whatever that might look like. Because God, this world today needs a different kind of presence from our Christianity, from our evangelicalism, from whatever religious backgrounds we've come from that might have even instilled fear in us. Help us to be different. Thanks, God. In Jesus' name, amen.